The Final Chapter on JFK. Chapter 2, Possible Suspects. Segment 1, USSR.
Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is Chapter 2, Possible Suspects, a little bit higher level here. And compared to the list of unlikely suspects, our first suspect we're going to be discussing today is the USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Soviet Union in short. And we're going to be looking at and determining whether or not they're more likely a probable suspect and can go up higher on the list, or maybe can be discarded. So let's look at the full facts of the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union during this period of time to determine whether or not they were a likely suspect in this case. The Soviet Union theory was advanced by Lyndon Johnson within hours of Kennedy's death. And he created the theory in a way that people wouldn't go into depth and go any further because it might have unthinkable consequences, such as a nuclear war. Now, the Red Plot theory was based upon the U.S.'s fear of both Cuba with Castro and the Soviet Union with Nikita Khrushchev. And with both of those men being powerful men in their own countries, the theory was that for whatever reason they conspired together to either use Oswald or some third party to kill Kennedy. The difficulty with that thought is, while Kennedy invaded Cuba, which was a satellite country to the Soviet Union, in 1962, the Soviet Union brought in some nuclear weapons into the country of Cuba, pointed, of course, directly at the United States, and this led to a showdown, and it was a public showdown between the United States and the Soviet Union / Cuba as to who was going to blink first. And ultimately, Kennedy put up a blockade around Cuba, and it looked like President Kennedy stood up to the Soviets and to Castro, and he was a very strong and forceful president. The reality is that there was a secret deal cut between the Soviet ambassador in Washington, D.C., and John Kennedy's brother, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy. And the ambassador and Robert Kennedy apparently were even meeting in parking lot garages, negotiating a deal where the U.S. would pull out, but not publicly state that they were pulling out, nuclear weapons, and these were antiquated weapons, by the way, from the country of Turkey and from Italy in exchange for the Soviets pulling out their nuclear weapons from Cuba. And this was a this for that. It worked out. It was a secret deal. No one knew about it. And in fact, even President Johnson, when he took office, was still not aware of the deal that Kennedy had struck until halfway into his term. So, with that said, although there may have been hostility between the countries, when it came down to the end with the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, things changed. And the relationship between the premier of the Soviet Union and the president of the United States blossomed. Khrushchev, if you can imagine, sent during that time, up until Kennedy's death, 27 personal letters to Kennedy. Outside of using couriers, he was using ambassadors. 27 letters between these two men up until Kennedy's death. To look even further into this, after this showdown with the Cuban Missile Crisis, a hotline or open line between the two countries was proposed between Kennedy and Khrushchev in June of 1963, and they actually had it installed in both nations at the end of August of 1963. And this was the first time leaders of hostile countries had an access to communicate directly and immediately with each other in the event that there was some need. Following that, the relationship became so strong that when Kennedy was at the United Nations in September of 1963, and he was speaking to all of the delegates at the UN, he suggested that in the future, the United States and the Soviet Union
should work together and develop a team with the two countries of going to the moon, a lunar team. He suggested that. And beyond that, on top of these other items, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union negotiated a nuclear test ban treaty. People were actually calling Kennedy a traitor when he worked that deal, but it was to stop the advancement and more testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere.
At the time of President Kennedy's death, the Soviets had worked a wheat deal with the United States to get $250 million worth of wheat that was needed for their people back to their country. That in today's dollars would be about $2.5 billion worth of wheat. Now, clearly, a country that has people starving, has a bad crop or a bad year, isn't going to kill a president when they're in the midst of getting food for their people. And we can go even further because the KGB, which is an organization like our CIA, did an investigation of the Kennedy killing. And their conclusion was that Lee Harvey Oswald was not the killer, but rather maybe the succeeding president of the United States was. And this information was actually conveyed to Lyndon Johnson himself by J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, who had heard about that through some FBI wiretaps, and he passed that information on to Johnson. And after this, the premier of the Soviet Union, who had been retired and replaced, was interviewed, both he and his wife. And I want to point out the summary of the interview with some arrows on here. And Nikita Khrushchev first talks about how he admired Kennedy. The Khrushchevs loved Mrs. Kennedy. And in here he talks about the fact that he doesn't believe anything about Lee Harvey Oswald being a lone assassin, and rather that it is a ultra-right-wing conspiracy of some sort. Khrushchev played coy during that interview, not going any further, even though he knew that the Soviets had information within their ranks about who may have been involved in the Kennedy assassination. He never talked about it. And the Soviet government, through the rest of its duration, never brought to the forefront to anyone was the fact that the Soviet KGB had material that Lyndon Johnson was involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Whether that's true or not, it's definitely clear that the Soviet Union was not a probable or prime suspect in the killing of John F. Kennedy. So let's move the Soviet Union off the list of possible suspects and go on to the next one, which is the military-industrial complex. See you soon for that one.